Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always said, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
Hello guys, it's great to be here today. You know, my project on Jordan Bankston Noble. As you can see, I am a white person. And I've had a lot of grief because I was writing a book about a slave. Well, you can see the book behind me, The Slave's Gamble, Choosing Sides in the War of 1812. That was a book I published in 2013 about slaves and free blacks who fought in the War of 1812. And when I wrote that book, I had the good opportunity to teach the first time at the United States Naval Academy as the class of 1957 Distinguished Chair in Naval Heritage. And in that point in time, that book just come out, and because it's about the War of 1812, and a lot of the War of 1812 was fought in the Chesapeake Bay, I bet I gave 100 book talks in Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania at the time, which was a wonderful opportunity. But one thing I did in that book, I wrote little vignettes at the beginning of each chapter that talked about an individual slave or free black and what they did to try to better their situation. Well, that right there convinced me that I should try to do a project that I really thought could work for me. Well, while I was at the Naval Academy, I had the good opportunity to be able to get a contract for a military history textbook. And this is a textbook that I've learned from Dr. Cavell is being used here at Southeastern now, called In Harm's Way, The American Military Experience. And I was able to get 2 authors to help co-author it with me, published by Oxford University Press. And I tell you, the process of getting the contract, which I got in 2015, and then getting it in print, boy, that was a headache I'd never experienced before in my life. We wrote the first draft and we sent it in. Well, when we sent the first draft in, Oxford sent it out to 10 university professors and got feedback from them, and we had to take their comments and incorporate it into the revisions. And we're thinking, oh my God, that took better part of a year and a half. And then when we did all the revisions, we sent it back in. Oxford sent it out to 9 additional faculty members. 19 people read this and gave us feedback that we had to incorporate. Well, what I learned later, the reason they do that is so that those 19 people will adopt it for their classes. And so since then, the book came out in the early part of 2020. And as you know, about March 15th of 2020 is when the pandemic struck. And during 2020, the book didn't sell hardly any copies. But then once the pandemic ended and classes got back to a sense of normality, all of a sudden the book exploded. And it's being used at the United States Military Academy now. It's being used at the United States Naval Academy. I've heard that it's even considered being adopted at the United States Air Force Academy, but I know it's adopted at University of Texas, the University of Washington, Kansas State. I noticed it's been adopted at Ohio State. So the book has done reasonably well. But that process of getting the contract, writing, revising, and then finally getting in print was the better part of 5 years. And as we were waiting for the process of it going passed the second revision, that's when I decided I had to write another book. And I joke about this all the time with my students. The reason I write books, it keeps me off the street, out of trouble. You know, I'm not going out getting drunk or doing drugs. I'm figuring out something to think about, and it's always challenging my thought process. Well, I decided I would take one of the slaves from my book, The Slave's Gamble. And when I wrote about the Battle of New Orleans, the slave I chose to write about was Jordan Bankston Noble, Andrew Jackson's drummer boy at the Battle of New Orleans. So the first thing I chose to do, I chose to Google him. And I found a number of websites, including a Wikipedia site that I clicked on. And that's what popped up. And as you can see there, Jordan Bankston Noble, also known as Jordan B. Noble, born October 14th, 1800, died June 20th, 1890. Well, you know, as I read that, I was like, okay. And then I started looking at the sources. Well, when I looked at the sources, I looked at that one at the bottom. That last one is Brian Kilmeade's book on the Battle of New Orleans. And I read that and I thought, that's not a very good book at all. But then right above that, there's one that said, the rattle of his drum was heard even in the midst of battle. Well, I clicked on that thinking, okay, let's see what this is about. Well, when I did, lo and behold, it was a National Park Service article that I had been asked to write in 2015. I thought, wait a minute. Am I really the expert on it? I don't think so. Well, I clicked on the second one, the second link, and it was a presentation being offered by me. I was like, wait a minute. This was from my book, The Slave's Gamble. Okay, I know when I do teacher talks on that, I highlight 3 of the individual slaves and I talk about their experiences and how they relate that to the War of 1812. Well, then when I clicked on that third one, of course, it was another Park Service article by me. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I am not the expert on Jordan Bankston Noble. So when you look at 4 of those sources for that Wikipedia article, they were me. And I'm thinking, I am not the expert on Jordan Bankston Noble. And that more or less convinced me I had to work on Jordan Bankston Noble. So beginning in 2017, at the time I was dating a young woman who lived over in Madisonville, in Covington. I would come down and see her for a little while, and basically she worked in New Orleans, so she'd cross the bridge and she'd go to work, and I'd go down the notarial archives and do some work. And I started finding a little stuff about Jordan Noble. And what I found is that, oh my God, while a lot of people know or who have heard of Jordan Bankston Noble, Andrew Jackson, drummer boy at the Battle of New Orleans, what they don't know are other details about his life. Well, on May 30th, 1868, a 68-year-old Jordan Bankston Noble had the opportunity to give a speech at the commemoration of the New Orleans National Cemetery at Chalmette. And if you know anything about that cemetery, there's more than 12,000 soldiers from the War of 1812 and the American Civil War who were buried there. And Jordan was the 4th speaker. The 3 speakers before him had all gotten up and had talked about the American Civil War. So when Jordan Noble stands up and talks, he didn't want to address the Great War and the Rebellion that had concluded with General Grant's defeat of General Lee. He asked forgiveness for focusing on the location that the cemetery was at, and this spot, as he said, this spot not far from here, where 53 years ago I had the honor to be present under our great commander, Major General Andrew Jackson. And after giving the attendees a vivid and interesting description of what had happened here, during the Battle of January 8, 1815, he hoped the audience would not attribute to personal vanity the mentions of my services to my country. Well, continuing, Noble proudly shared with the audience that he had enlisted as a drummer in the 7th Regiment during the War of 1812 and served for the durations of the New Orleans campaign. Then he claimed that he was discharged on the 8th of May, 1816, re-enlisted with the same regiment the same day for 5 years, and honorably discharged at Baton Rouge. He again re-enlisted in the 1st United States Infantry and informally served as a substitute 4 years, 4 months, and 14 days. Noble then mentioned, "I was honorably discharged from the United States Army in 1825. Well, despite this articulate storytelling, the 68-year-old's memory was a little bit faulty, because Noble had not been discharged on May 8, 1816. When you look at Jackson's orders and Jackson's materials, you'll find that he was discharged on March 8th, 1815, so more than a full year before. And Jordan continued his speech by talking about his service in the Second Seminole War. He served 3 months in the Louisiana Volunteers before returning to New Orleans. And at the time he was with the Louisiana Volunteers, he was a part of the detachment that buried the bodies of those who had been massacred in the Dade Massacre. And apparently Jordan Noble played his drum as those individuals were being buried. Well, Noble proudly said that after he got back to New Orleans, he served for 2 more years as in the recruiting service before being honorably discharged. Noble proudly but humbly boasted about his military service and highlighted, even though he talked about these 2 conflicts, he highlighted his service in the Battle of New Orleans because it occurred at the location where he had served under the famed General and President Andrew Jackson. Well, it remained a highlight of Jordan Noble's military experience. And throughout his later years, he talked about he had served under General and President Andrew Jackson. He had served under General and President Zachary Taylor during the Mexican-American War. But you know, one thing Jordan Noble did not mention in 1868 when he was giving that speech is that he had been enslaved at the time of the War of 1812. And why did he not mention that? Well, probably because it would have corrupted his story. It would have laid the foundation for him not receiving future pensions from the federal government. And even though slavery had been discontinued with the 13th Amendment in 1865, what a lot of people don't know is that Jordan Noble had been a slave until 1837. And after that point in time, he worked to try to gain the freedom of other enslaved peoples. Well, obviously in the Battle of New Orleans, Jordan Noble had played a very important role as a drummer. And in fact, it was reportedly said that his drumming could be heard even in the hottest hell of fire. He participated in the night battle of December 23rd. And he participated in the campaign beginning there at Chalmette a little later in December on through January 8th. But what a lot of people don't know is that Jordan Bankston Noble, he was actually born an enslaved mulatto in Augusta, Georgia, to his slave mother Judith and his white father, slave owner, John Young Bankston. And he had come to New Orleans apparently in 1811, or late 1811 or early 1812, when John Young Bankston came as a part of an army detachment. And apparently Bankston had brought Judith and Jordan with him, probably to serve his domestic needs. And the question I began to question was, why did he bring Judith and Jordan to New Orleans? Did he think that he could bring them to the city because of the burgeoning opportunities to sell your slaves? Well, that was a good question. And in many respects, I'm convinced that's why he did bring them. Because as you can see, John Young Bankston sold Judith and Jordan to a man named John Brant in early 1813. And this man, John Brant, he was actually from East Baton Rouge. But he owned several East Baton Rouge properties. He owned several properties in New Orleans. He also owned a warehouse in New Orleans. And he marketed items, all kinds of items, from peas and tobacco to muscatel, wine, and slaves. And by doing that, he ultimately sold Jordan Bankston. John Young Bankston had sold Jordan and Judith, his mother, to John Brant and had made some money from that. Well, John Brant apparently did not hold on to these slaves very long, because as you can see, by November of 1813, November 15th, 1813, Brant had revised the ages of the two slaves in the contract that he signed with a Frenchman by the name of Jean Gazon Chalmette. And at the time, he tried to make them look younger. He sold the 30-year-old black woman, Judith, or Judy, and her 7-year-old black son, Jordan, for about 550 piastres, or basically the French word for $550. And Chalmette, he was a slave trader. And in fact, Chalmette would hold these slaves until June of 1814, when ultimately Chalmette sold Judith and Jordan. And one thing's interesting about Jordan when you start looking him up, his name is spelled a lot of different ways. Jordan, Jourdin, Jourdan. I mean, it's spelled a lot of different ways. But ultimately, Chalmette would sell on June 2nd, 1814, would sell Judith and Jordan to John Noble. John Noble was the 7th Infantry Regiment. He had arrived in New Orleans that summer. He basically bought the two slaves to provide contributive domestic service for him and his fellow officers. And basically what's interesting about this, in the contract that Chalmette signed with Jordan Noble, he listed that Jordan Noble was age 8, his mother was age 27. And at the time, Jordan Noble was actually almost 14. Well, normally what happened in slave sales in New Orleans is that slaves that were listed as younger than the age of 10 could not be separated from their mother according to the Louisiana Slave Code Noir. And that's why you often see slaves being listed as a younger age, so they can be kept together. And ultimately, the idea is that by keeping their ages young, it means that they have longer contributive service to your family. Well, the thing about it, that's one of the things that was going to impact Jordan Noble's life. Throughout his life, he would frequently list his birth date from as early as 1796 to 1800 to 1804. I mean, one time he even listed 1788. So it's only until he got a little older in life that he had settled in on the year 1800. And the reinforcing of the uncertainty about Jordan Noble's birth date, that created problems for Jordan Noble throughout his life. Now, the new owner, John Noble, he was a lieutenant in the 7th Infantry Regiment. He would serve during the night battle of December 23rd. He also served, he would be wounded in that night battle. Jordan Noble would be playing his drum during that night battle. Playing the drum during a battle was not a way to keep the troops entertained, it was a way to convey information to them. Because in the thick of battle and the craziness of conflict, the beating of that drum was loud enough that orders could be used to convey to the soldiers via drum beats. And ultimately what we see there is that Jordan Noble is ultimately going to take the surname of John Noble. Why? Because he was amazed at John Noble's bravery during that night battle of December 23rd. John Noble would be wounded, as was a man named Colonel Alexander White, and yet, because John Noble owned Jordan and Judith, Jordan would ultimately take Noble's surname. Well, why does he choose the name Bankston? Well, a number of authors have suggested that the reason he chose the name Bankston because the word Bankston comes from a Swedish word that means of the bank, and that Jordan Noble had served on the Rodriguez Canal near the bank of the Mississippi River during the Battle of New Orleans. Well, I don't think that's why he chose the middle name Bankston. I think he chose the middle name Bankston because that was his birth father's surname. So Jordan, his name, Bankston, his birth father's name, Noble, the man who owned him at the time of the Battle of New Orleans. Well, by May of 1815, because John Noble had been badly wounded in the night fighting, he would not make a healthy recovery. He only continued to worsen. And by May of 1815, Lieutenant John Noble would sell Judith and Jordan to a fellow officer named Colonel Alexander White, who had also been wounded in the night fighting of December 23rd. Well, ultimately what was going to happen here is that when Alexander White, or Colonel White, secured Jordan and Judith, by that point in time, he had arrived in New Orleans in 1812. He had brought his wife, who he had met in Baton Rouge, and they had 3 children by the time of the Battle of New Orleans. They lived in New Orleans, and he had been wounded, and he and John Noble basically stayed in the Spanish barracks in New Orleans at the time of the battle throughout the spring to recover from their injuries. And finally, they would be discharged by the late spring of 1815 as well. Well, ultimately, Colonel White, at the end of the battle, since he was now discharged, he was actually promoted before his discharge. He was Major White, and by the time of the end of the battle, he was now promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and so he became known as Colonel White. And ultimately, Colonel White had bought land in West Baton Rouge Parish. In fact, it is on the western margins of the Mississippi River, opposite of the upper end of Prophet's, or what's known as Brown's Island. And the interesting thing about it is that the White family, his wife Elizabeth Lilly White, she had come from West Baton Rouge. Her father was Thomas Lilly, a very prominent West Baton Rouge settler. And he had died by the time of the Battle of New Orleans. And ultimately, Alexander White, his wife Elizabeth, and their 3 children, and Judith and Jordan, reportedly came to New Orleans, from New Orleans to Baton Rouge to cross the river to Port Allen, West Baton Rouge Parish. And this plantation that he bought north of the river was actually about 480 acres. It had almost 12 acres confronting the river. And Alexander White, when he came to West Baton Rouge Parish, he began to rise in notoriety because he was known as Colonel White. And he became a member of the West Baton Rouge parish police jury, I should say. I wanted to say police parish jury. Parish police jury. And that was an organization that basically selected the sheriff, determined the sheriff's salary, also determined compensation for all county services, fines for violations of rules. They determined tax rates. And basically, Alexander White was becoming a person of importance. But by 1820, Alexander White was having problems. He and his wife and their children were living on the plantation that had been owned by her previous father, Thomas Lilly. But they also had this plantation here. And then all of a sudden, this period from 1815 to 1832, and studying Jordan Bankston Noble's life, became very complicated. In fact, what's going to happen is that, remember I said that Jordan Noble said he had served in the military until 1825. Well, federal records say nothing about him serving until that point in time. And the question was, if he was enslaved, he would not receive salary for serving. His masters would receive the salary for his service. So the question was, did he really serve? Well, there's no financial records in Alexander White's accounts that indicate that Jordan Noble served. But nonetheless, by 1821, Alexander White was experiencing financial difficulties. Apparently, while he was rising in prominence, he was a pretty crappy businessman. He wasn't able to really make money at his farming productions. And by the end of the year 1821, the sheriff of West Baton Rouge Parish, Richard Devall, had basically warned that this plantation here was going to be put up for tax auction. Well, that being the case, what would happen to Jordan and his mom Judith? Well, fortunately, because he was on the parish police jury, he was able to delay that tax auction, the sheriff's sale, until December of 1822. And when that happened, very few people have written anything about it, but there is a historian, a man that many of you may have heard of. His name is Jerry Brock. He is a music historian in New Orleans. And he wrote an article about Jordan Noble's slave service. And what he said in that article is that during that sheriff's cell that a man named John Reed, R-E-E-D. John Reed had been a soldier. He had been on Zebulon Pike's expedition to the west. He had fought in the Battle of New Orleans. And that John Reed had bought Jordan Noble. Well, interesting thing about it, that official sheriff's cell document does not mention the name John R-E-E-D at all. It mentions the name John R-E-I-D, John Reed. And digging into those records, I found out that John R-E-I-D, he was a tutor in New Orleans, a tutor of young children. He was also a county clerk, a court clerk in West Baton Rouge Parish. And it was not the John Reed that Jerry Brock had talked about. And Jerry Brock said that John Reed bought the property that Alexander White had sold, including the slaves. Well, what I found in that sheriff's cell document was that all the property of that estate that had been sold, all of it was bought by a woman named Edith Duvall. She was the wife of Sheriff Richard Duvall. And what's kind of interesting about it, she is the aunt of Alexander White's now dead wife. Alexander White's wife died in 1820 when she gave birth to a young child. The child died and she died, but yet her mother's sister was Edith Duvall. So basically the Duvall family and the Lilly family and the White family were all united families. So the fact that Edith Duvall bought all the property and only paid $225 for it. So she got a real bargain. 480 acres for $225, that's a bargain. Plus, reportedly, all the slaves. Well, ultimately what we find here is that this is a complex story. While all the property is bought by Edith, I tried to find an inventory of all the property that was sold. Well, reportedly, the West Baton Rouge Parish Clerk gave me access to all the volumes that I needed. But I asked him about one volume in particular that mentioned the inventory of all the items sold. It was in Book A, page 4, number 3, on the 10th day of January 1823. Yet according to the parish clerk, that volume has been gone or destroyed for years. No one knew where it was at. And author Brock mentioned that White was forced to liquidate his property, but there was no indication that the sale embodied the entirety of Alexander White's property. It only embodied that property off of Prophet's Island or Brown's Island. It did not include the Lilly estate. In fact, the property acquired by the colonel's former family member and the enslaved, including Jordan Noble, could have potentially remained in the White family or even passed to Edith Duvall and her family. Well, since the name Jordan Noble was not included in any of the White estate probates of later years, because by 1830 Alexander White dies, well, we can assume that he became associated with Edith Duvall. Well, Edith Duvall was married to the Sheriff Richard Duvall. They had both been married before, so he had 2 children before his marriage to Edith. She had 2 children before her marriage to Richard, and together they had 8 children, 12 kids. That was 12 rabbit holes that I ended up running down trying to find more information about Jordan Noble. And basically what I found is that one of the children, one of her earlier children, named William Joyce, that he had went into a business deal In 1829, he had gone into a business deal with a West Baton Rouge notary and judge named Louis Favreau. And basically, William Joyce and Favreau, in early 1829, they signed a business contract with a couple of brothers from Alabama. These brothers, a pair of brothers, one of them named Viscount Mosh Jones, and the other one named Alphonse C. Jones. And that business deal was to create sugar plantations along the Mississippi River. And ultimately what happens is that the brothers provided the land and the slaves, and then the Jones brothers worked the operation. They managed the operation. Well, one of the slaves that Louis Favreau brought into the deal was a young woman whose name is actually Pauline Évariste. She was roughly about 28 years old, and she had a child. And in the legal transaction, it said that Pauline Évariste and her daughter, age 8, would be brought into this arrangement where they would work the plantation. Well, Pauline Évariste apparently had a child whose name was Valerie. Valerie was not a girl, it was a boy. And his father was none other than Jordan Bankston Noble. Pauline Évariste and Jordan Bankston Noble had known one another for a number of years and had probably developed a relationship, and she had given birth to Valerie Noble, who became Jordan's oldest child. Well, in 1829, the Duval estate began a process by which they distributed all the property. Called Edith Duval had died, Richard Duval had died, and basically some of the slaves of the family were given to William Jones, and he was in that deal with Louis Favreau. But ultimately what was going to happen is that during the late 1820s, after she dies, the story becomes a lot more complicated. Because with 12 kids, that's those 12 rabbit holes, legal rabbit holes I had to continually climb down to try to find out more about Jordan Noble. Well, ultimately what I find out is that Jordan Noble apparently was a part of the Edith Duval family. Apparently he was given to William Joyce, one of the older sons of the family, and that Jones and Favreau had signed this agreement with the two Alabama brothers, but ultimately what Favreau chose to do was sell his slave Pauline Évariste, sell his slave to a young man a grocer by the name of Francois Toulouse. He had a grocery store in Baton Rouge and in West Baton Rouge. And what he found is that being in Baton Rouge trying to make money, it was difficult because a lot of time people didn't pay you what they owed you. So by 1830, Francois Toulouse had decided to sell his businesses in West Baton Rouge and open a new store in New Orleans. And he had begun purchasing property in New Orleans. And basically Favreau had sold Pauline Évariste and her 3 children by this point in time to Francois Toulouse. And as you can see here, her 3 children, Valerie, Juliet and Pauline would be bought by Francois Toulouse, and at that point the name Jordan Noble never appeared in the legal transactions. But Jordan Noble probably was transferred as well. Why? Well, because Louis Favreau had served in the Battle of New Orleans. He knew of Jordan Noble. Francois Toulouse had served in the Battle of New Orleans. He also knew of Jordan Noble. So as Pauline Évariste was sold and her children, Jordan Noble was probably passed along as well. But ultimately what happened is that the first time that Jordan Noble's name actually appeared in a New Orleans city guide, and there are city guides from New Orleans back to the early 1800s. The first time it appears in a city guide is actually in 1834. And it mentioned that this Jordan Noble, that he was a grocer living in New Orleans. And he lived at 12 Hospital Street. Well, the interesting thing about that city guide, it was published in December of 1833, and all the information was gathered in 1833. So probably by the end of the year 1833, Jordan Noble, he was there. And he was listed as a separate individual. However, it doesn't mention that he is enslaved. He was still enslaved at this time. Well, the interesting thing about it is that Jordan Noble, you see that little musical instrument there at the top, and sometime 1832, 1833, Jordan Noble probably purchased this drum from Clem and Brothers on Canal Street, a musical store that had opened there. And that drum would be the device that he played during the Seminole War, during the Mexican War, and during the New Orleans celebrations thereafter. It's now in the possession of the Historic New Orleans Collection. They purchased it from a private collector about 2 to 3 years ago. And ultimately what we see here is that by 1836, Francois Toulouse agreed to let Jordan Noble enlist in the New Orleans Volunteers, the Louisiana Volunteers, that would serve in the Second Seminole War. Well, Jordan Noble took that drum with him. He served for 3 months, and during that 3 months they traveled throughout Florida. They landed near Tampa, they went inland to Osceola, and basically worked their way back. They buried the survivors of the Dade Massacre. They came back, they survived attacks. Jordan Noble survived, and he returned. And by the summer of 1836, he was back, and his family was happy that he had returned, he had survived, and he and Pauline had another child. This is a child that would be called Desiree. And by 1837, Francois Toulouse's health was declining. His health was in bad shape. And he began making plans for his death. In fact, during the spring of 1837, he met with a man, a notary in New Orleans named Amédée Ducatel. And he began plans to free many of his slaves, sell his property, and make provisions. He had 2 descendants that lived in France. He had no American descendants. And so, as he makes his plans, he has a private meeting with Pauline. And he tells her and her family, they will be given their freedom upon his death. Well, His death would happen on June 22nd, 1837. 60-year-old Frenchman Francois Toulouse died, and it was anticipated that his death was caused because of venereal disease. And this document right here in the New Orleans Notarial Archive provides that Francois Ducoing, the testamentary executor of the Francois Toulouse estate, says that the following named slaves, Pauline, a Negro woman aged about 34 years, together with her children, Valerie, age 10, Juliet, age 8, Marianne, 4, and Desiree, age 2 years. And then as you can see, it says below that, Jordan, a mulatto aged about 34 years. Well, by that point in time, Jordan Noble was about 37. But nonetheless, that event right there provided Jordan Noble and his family freedom. Francois Toulouse had granted them freedom because of the service that Pauline and her children had provided to Francois Toulouse during his life. And ultimately what we see there is that changed Jordan Noble's life forever. He had fought in 2 wars as a slave, the War of 1812 and the Seminole War. And he didn't understand that there'd be future wars to come, but he would have a chance to serve in those as well. Well, from his time gaining his freedom in 1837, there were some interesting provisions of that Francois Toulouse testament, will and testament. It said that there were a number of slaves that Toulouse was going to free, but that Jordan Noble had to pay $500 to get their freedom. But then the slaves had to work for Jordan Noble and pay him back the $500. Well, Jordan did that. He paid the $500 because his wife was given a sizable sum of money from Francois Toulouse when he died. His daughter was given some property, and they were given a lot of other items. So they basically had everything they needed, and they had some money. And Jordan Noble, he continued playing his drum. He'd play his drum in the city to get people's attention and gain donations. And people made those. Well, by 1846, as you know, we're on the verge of another war. A war that involved Texas and Mexico. It's a war about the boundary line between the new state of Tejas and the Mexican Republic. And ultimately, Jordan Noble would volunteer again and serve in the Louisiana Volunteers. And he would serve for 3 months. By the time they arrived in Texas along the coast, Zachary Taylor had already won the battles of the Battle of Resaca de la Palma on May 8th and the May 9th, the battle. I can't remember that one right off the top of my head, but nonetheless, he had won both of those. So by the time Jordan Noble and these Louisiana Volunteers arrived, they literally do nothing for 3 months other than drill on a daily basis. Why? Because ultimately Taylor is able to get the federal government to lengthen the time of service of volunteers from 3 months to 1 year. And by that point in time, these Louisiana Volunteers had already agreed to terms of service. So they remain in Texas 3 months and then they go home. Well, nonetheless, Jordan Noble would take from that 3-month tour of duty that he had served under Zachary Taylor there in South Texas. And in fact, writers would later say that he had even served in Mexico during the war. He never made it into Mexico. Or if he did, he simply crossed the Rio Grande. He wasn't an immigrant trying to get back into the country. He was just simply trying to go home. Well, during this period after the Mexican War, he returned, and the city of New Orleans started having monumental celebrations on January 8th to celebrate the Battle of New Orleans. And Jordan Noble would play his drum in every occasion, playing the music he had played during the Battle of New Orleans, and he became a bit of a celebrity. In fact, as you can see by this, in 1880, the veterans of the Mexican War would give him a certificate. Well, he would also get, in 1851, General Winfield Scott, who had served in the Mexican War, came to New Orleans, and during the celebration after January 8th, there was a big banquet, and he invited Jordan Noble to the forefront. He was the only African American there in that room, and he gave him a brass medal for his service in 3 wars at that point in time. No one mentioned that 2 wars as a slave and 1 war as a free man. Well, during the American Civil War, Jordan Noble would again volunteer to serve. And what's kind of interesting about this story is that at the beginning of the war, Jordan Noble raised a regiment of African American troops to fight for the Confederacy. And a lot of people ask me, why did he fight for the Confederacy? Well, Jordan Noble always saw himself as a Louisianan, someone who was fighting for Louisiana and for New Orleans. Well, he was also an American. And so he originally volunteered to be a part of the Confederacy, but the Confederacy wasn't willing to accept African American soldiers. And the commanders there in New Orleans refused to give them weapons. And while they drilled on a daily basis, they didn't do anything other than drill. But then in the spring of 1862, Admiral David Farragut and the Union fleet arrived up the Mississippi River, and they marched into the city and demanded the surrender of the city. And by that point in time, all Confederate forces had fled. Jordan Noble and his African American volunteers, they had stayed in the city to protect their families and their homes. And once General Benjamin Butler arrived with Union occupational forces, Jordan Noble agreed to volunteer to serve in the Union Army. And General Butler accepted their willingness to volunteer. Jordan Noble would serve for 3 years during the American Civil War. During that time, the only campaign he would fight in is the Battle of Port Hudson. He was listed as Captain Jordan Noble. He did not get wounded, but then in October after the Battle of Port Hudson, October 63, he would be crossing a canal, walking on a wooden log, and he slipped off the log and fell into a pile of timber below it and badly wounded himself. In fact, he got a bad hernia. That hernia would bother him the rest of his life. And even though he had survived the war, in October, because of his injury, he would be dismissed from the military service. And in 1864, Jordan Noble started a black newspaper in New Orleans called the Black Republican. And it only printed editions for about 2 years before it went out of business. But then during American Reconstruction in the South, the process of trying to reconstruct Louisiana, basically Democrats had been pushed aside and Republicans had created a new regime in Louisiana. And basically, Jordan Noble was invited to apply to become a Metropolitan New Orleans policeman. And for about 4 years, he served as a policeman in the New Orleans Metropolitan Force. And that was an opportunity for Jordan because it gained him a bit of notoriety and fame. And after that, after he resigned from the police service, he drew a little pension for about 4 years. And he agreed to serve, because he was appointed by a Republican governor, he agreed to serve as an inspector of beef and pork in New Orleans. And people wondered, why was he appointed that position? Well, he knew a lot of the providers there in the city. And then later he will even be appointed as the keeper of the city park, of one city park there in New Orleans. And he would eventually come up on a claim that he was defrauding the city, and he would be removed from his position even though the claim had never proven. Well, after the period of Reconstruction, as you may know about Louisiana and New Orleans Reconstruction, it was a very controversial period with lots of racial violence, lots of violence, period. And ultimately, by the 1870s, although one Reconstruction would come to an end, Democratic rule would come back to Louisiana, and the views of the Old South would return. And segregation and black codes basically kept African Americans in places of subservient position. Well, Jordan Noble, he frequently got out in the community and played his drum. He still marched in New Orleans parades. And as you can see here by this little certificate, this was actually a card. It's in the possession of the Historic New Orleans Collection. It was from the North Central and South American Exposition held in 1885 until the spring of '86. And Jordan Noble was there. As you can see, his card has been punched many a times. He would play his drum there on a daily basis. He would talk about his service under General Andrew Jackson and General Zachary Taylor. Jordan Noble had become a celebrity, a real celebrity in New Orleans. And he embraced his celebrities because he tried to help his fellow African American citizens. And he tried to help all people. He was trying to be a good person. But as he got older, his health condition worsened. His hernia worsened. And the last part of his life, all he did was file for pensions to receive funds from the federal government for service in 4 wars. And he eventually got pensions for much of that service, but not for all of it. Even the land that he was promised from the War of 1812, he eventually got that, but he had to sell it because it was way up in Michigan. He wasn't going to Michigan. But by 1890, his health had declined. He had had a number. His second wife had died. His son, namesake Jordan Noble, had died. And by June 20th, 1890, on Friday morning, the New Orleans newspapers reported that at 8:30 in the morning, the 89-year-old Jordan Bankston Noble died quietly at the New Orleans home of 713 Dryades, where his 3 children, all of whom were far past the prime of life. The cause of death was given as old age, and the following day, the Picayune sadly reported the death of the drummer boy of Chalmette. And they ran that pen and ink drawing of Jordan Noble. The familiar face of old Jordan will no longer be seen upon the streets of New Orleans. And the paper encouraged family and friends to attend a Saturday afternoon funeral, to look on the white hair and the familiar face of old Jordan one last time. Now, while the article was very important, reminding people of Jordan's remarkable life, most of the time the papers get a lot of details very wrong. In fact, in that article, it mentioned that he was born in 1796, even though Jordan Noble himself claimed he had been born in 1800. And yes, he had been the drummer boy of Chalmette. He'd served under General Andrew Jackson. He had served in the Seminole War, the Mexican War. But most of the time, the articles rarely mention that Jordan Noble had raised a regiment of black troops for the Confederacy. And then they did not mention that they immediately changed their loyalty to the Union when David Farragut had taken the city. Well, yes, Jordan Noble gave lots of performances during his life. He played concerts, he gave talks, he talked about his experiences. He was known as a hero of the city. And the paper corrected stately that for some 75 years later, the famous drummer boy of New Orleans had gone to join his comrades from the Battle of New Orleans, as well as the other wars in which he had participated. The drummer boy of the Battle of New Orleans had died, and he would later be buried in the city's St. Louis Cemetery, number 2, square number 3. What can you say about Jordan Noble's life? He had gained considerable attention, he gained considerable fame and recognition, and for his services in the U.S. military, he had held the distinct honor. He was remarkable. He had served in 4 wars, and there are very few people, very few Americans who had served in 4 wars. And Noble never publicly spoke about his situation of being formerly enslaved, nor did he ever publicly admit who his owners had been. Yet after his death, papers all across the country began writing stories about the death of Jordan Noble. And there are a number of stories in which he is highlighted. But ultimately what you can say about Jordan Noble is that Jordan Noble always tightly held on to his position in the African American community. He tried to help his fellow African Americans. And my manuscript definitely makes a story about that. And ultimately, what you can see about him is that personally, when the many instances of discrimination and persecution came his way, Jordan Noble could simply take out his drum and beat it away. Far too many of Jordan Noble's contemporaries could not enjoy the same advantages that Jordan Noble had, that he could simply take out his drum and beat the discrimination and persecution away. So, thank you very much